So this is Baruch here at the Tikkun Elevator Kollel. Let me bring up the lecture that's here for today. Here we go. Now we've been learning about Hitler. We are his chosen people. In the last section we learned that Hitler's view was that it's a war of ideologies. A war that runs to the core of what the German people he saw, their true destiny. But in their way was the Jews, deeply involved, and a branch of the Jews called Christianity, and another branch which he claimed was Bolshevism or Marxism. All of these things have, that is, these two qualities, Christianity and Bolshevism, had a humanity kind of attitude. Want to help people, bring people up, how they did it and what was involved in it, all different kinds of things. But in relationship to the Jews, neither one of those were friendly. But in relationship to Hitler, all lumped together. Here we go to the consistent either-or worldview pieced together. Hitler had a very clear and consistent Weltanschauung. Now we are in a position to understand what he was saying to the Islamic Mufti in 1941, which at first blush seemed so irrational as he wrote in Mein Kampf. This was a decisive struggle. Ideologically, it was a battle between National Socialism and the Jews. The primal struggle of the World War was more about ideology than power and territory. And the only two heavyweight contenders were the Aryan Germans and the Jews. In 1922, NSDAP, that is a Nazi party meeting, Hitler had declared, here too, there can be no compromise. There are only two possibilities, either victory of the Aryan or annihilation of the Aryan and the victory of the Jew. 20 years later, his outlook remained unswerving. In a Berlin speech on January 30th, 1942, Hitler warned, "We realize that this war can only end either in the wiping out of the German nations or by the disappearance of Jewry from Europe." This worldview informed Hitler from his first political writing in September 1919 to his final written testament to the German people before killing himself in April 1945, in which he pledged the nation to continue fighting the Jews as their first priority. He asserted in a vain attempt to keep his philosophical dream alive, in a ghastly conflict like this, in a war in which two completely irreconcilable ideologies confront one another, the issue can inevitably be settled by the total destruction of one side or the other. Hitler dies as he had lived, relentlessly obsessed with the Jews. So let me read this again. In a ghastly conflict like this, in a war in which two so completely irreconcilable ideologies confront one another, the issue can inevitably only be just settled by the total destruction of one side or the other. Now, I have to think about where we are today. As we've seen, there was method to the evil Nazi madness. Nature dictated that the strong conquer the weak, but the Jews, they disrupted the paganistic world order through the conviction that there was something more powerful and important than physical force. The idea that man is not an animal but a spiritual being, and that therefore the law of the jungle, conquest, war, obsession, is morally wrong. The Jewish idea was winning. Therefore the Jews had to be eliminated. As the SS chief, this wonderful man, Heinrich Himmler, stated in 1943, we had the moral right and the duty toward our nation to kill the people which wished to kill us. Amazing. Now, he writes like this. Let me see how this is working out. Okay. Explaining the strange decisions. For Hitler, genocide of the Jews was not a peripheral undertaking of World War II. It was a core mission. As historian Lucia Davidovitz says in The War Against the Jews, the final solution transcended the bounds of modern historical experience. Never before in modern history had one people made the killing of another the fulfillment of an ideology, and not to achieve some kind of instrumental ends. And so there was a logic in keeping the trains rolling to Auschwitz, even as the Soviet forces advanced. Within the context of the Nazi worldview, these decisions were completely consistent. As French philosopher and political scientist Raymond Aron pointed out, as for genocide, I would say that its apparent irrationality results from a false perspective. If one is prepared to admit that the liquidation of the Jews was Hitler's primary aim, the industrial organization of death became rational as a means towards this end. Genocide. Once the genocide had been established as the aim, the materials, the men, and the means of transportation needed for this enterprise had to be diverted from the logistics of the armed forces. Similarly, the war's economic considerations were not a factor in the face of the priority of genocide. Even though the war effort was being harmed by the Holocaust machinery, as his historian Saul Friedlander observed, the final solution meant a loss for the German war economy, which was compensated only by a very small degree by the partial exploitation of Jews in slave labor and the property seized from the victims. In 1941, Alfred Rosenberg's Ministry of Occupied Eastern Territories, which were called Ostland, Poland, removed all doubt and ambiguity on this matter. In response to a mass murder directive, a subordinate asked for clarification. Please advise me as to whether your request of October 31st is to be interpreted as an order to liquidate all Jews in Ostland. Is that to be done regardless of age and sex and economic interests, such as the need of the Wehrmacht for skilled laborers in munitions factories? Rosenberg answered flatly, in reply to your letter of November 15th, 1941, economic interests are to be on the whole disregarded in the solution of the Jewish problem. For Hitler, the genocide of the Jews was a central mission of World War II, not a side issue. This explains why the Nazis continued transporting Jews to Auschwitz even as Soviet forces advanced prioritizing the extermination of Jews over the war effort's logistic and economic needs. Next, we will explore Hitler's idea of Jewish DNA, delving into how he believed Jewish ideology to be rooted in their beings, further fueling his genocidal determination. Hitler's idea of Jewish DNA. Hitler's understanding of the Jew went another important step further. He realized that the Jewish ideas were an essential and inescapable characteristic of their race. This is why Hitler considered the Jewish problem more serious than the Christian and Marxist problems. This led him to conclude that the solution for the Jews was much more challenging and radical. Only the Jewish problem required genocide. On July 21, 1941, Hitler told Croatian Foreign Minister Vaternik, one of the founders of the brutal Ustasha movement, responsible for some of the worst atrocities of the Holocaust, if only one country, for whatever reason, tolerates a Jewish family in it, that family will become the germ center for fresh sedition. If there were no longer any Jews in Europe, the unity of the countries of Europe would no longer be disturbed. That's very interesting. There are very few Jews left in Europe, but that's, of course, in many places in Europe. But, of course, there are still Jews there. Hitler believed that every Jew was intrinsically connected with Judaism and Jewish ethics, irrespective of their beliefs and education. Therefore, each one represented a serious threat. In order for the German nation to defeat the human concept and establish the new world order, every Jewish man, woman, and child, regardless of nationality, profession, influence, or religious beliefs, had to be eliminated. Hitler explained on several occasions that the various human ideologies were alien to the German/European character, but for the last 3 centuries, the country, Germany, had been subjected to the influence of Christianity, but Christianity is not a natural religion for the Germans, but a religion that has been imported and which strikes no responsive chord in their hearts and is foreign to the inherent genius of the race. On the other hand, according to Hitler, the Jews had always been a people with definite racial characteristics and never just a religion. Therefore, the Jew could never become a German. If he wanted to become a German, he would have to give up becoming a Jew. That he cannot do. The Jew cannot become a German at heart for a number of reasons. First, because of his blood. Second, because of his character. Third, because of this will. Fourth, because of his actions. His actions remain Jewish, and he works for the greater idea of the Jewish people. Hitler argued that the Jewish characteristics were embedded in the Jew as part of their nature. The internal expurgation of the Jewish spirit is not possible in any Platonic way, for the Jewish spirit is a product of the Jewish person. Unless we expel the Jewish people soon, they will have Judaized our people within a very short time. As with his overall Weltanschauung, these notions were not Hitler original. Dietrich Eckart, one of the founding members of the German Workers' Party, which later became the Nazi Party, was one of Hitler's mentors. In one of their conversations, Hitler explained why Martin Luther's proposal of some 200 years earlier to burn synagogues and Jewish houses was an inefficient solution. Even if there had never been a synagogue or a Jewish school or the Old Testament, the Jewish spirit would still exist and exert its influence. It has been there from the beginning, and there is no Jew, not a single one, who does not personify it. To the Nazis, a Jewish atheist or convert to Christianity was as bad as any other kind of Jew. The Jewish idea could not be separated from the body and soul of the Jew. Even when recreant Jews would say abjured from God, Rosenberg argued they only put in his place what was essentially the same concept under other names. This they called humanism or liberty or liberalism. We have that today. The Democrats, the Republicans, so on and so forth. The Nazis saw the rigid religious outlook with its moral demands for restraint and compassion as a necessary product of the Jewish person. It was in their blood. There was no way to uproot this misguided value system from European civilization without destroying the source, that's the Jews who not only created it, but embodied it. Nazi ideologists thus regarded the notion of secular Jewry as oxymoronic. As Alfred Rosenberg wrote, we find this method of the Talmud exactly reflected in the spiritual frame of mind of our Jewish journalists and lawyers. They act in accordance with the Talmud even when they know nothing of it. For it was not the Talmud which made the Jews, but the Jews that made the Talmud. To Hitler and the Nazi ideologues, this intrinsic Jewish character also explained the Jewish development of socialist ideas for a utopian brotherhood of man. Rosenberg put in bluntly in his 1920 Race and Race History, communistic thinking had been formed long before Marx. However, the clever Jew welded it together and molded it into a rigid form. Later we will speak about the Jewish spirit and about that determination which represents the center of the Jewish character. Since every Jew was a super spreader of the humanism of Judaism, the Nazis deduced that genocide was the only real solution, because even when Jews abandoned their religion, They continued to propound its moral and ethical teaching in manifold secular and intellectual ways. Judaism, Christianity, and Bolshevism were variations of the same theme. Some more, some less, religion of creating a humane world and putting together the Jewish ideas had successfully transformed Europe. The accusations leveled by Nazi propagandists against the Jews were often contradictory, blaming them simultaneously for capitalism and Marxism, for religion and atheism, for morality and immorality. Despite these contradictions, the Nazi leadership maintained a consistent understanding of the deeper ideological world war that motivated them. They believed with absolute clarity of conviction that their revolution was the world's final chance, the last battle against the Jewish idea. Furthermore, Hitler was confident that eliminating the Jews would prevent any other group, religion, or power from reviving those ideas. He believed that if he could destroy the root, that is, the Jewish people, he would eradicate everything that stemmed from them. The Jew plays in the nature the role of a catalyzing element. A people that is rid of its Jews returns spontaneously to the natural order. Now he writes like this to summarize Hitler's worldview, and now we get a much better idea of why building a Holocaust museum is not going to help. World War II was about ideology. European man was meant to develop by adhering to natural laws of survival of the fittest, which, as social Darwinism maintained, propels the evolution of man. An opposing ideology of humanitarianism had challenged this idea and achieved near victory. This victorious ideology was created by none other than the Jewish people. Christianity and communism/Bolshevism were also enemy and basically Jewish ideologies because they were fundamentally humanistic. Jews were different because the ideology was inside their spiritual nature and makeup. It's not something they adopted. The hour was late since he was losing, The hour was late since he was losing. But Hitler took upon himself the mammoth task of saving Germany and Europe by starting a war to eliminate the enemy ideologies and recalibrate Europe. To do this, the elimination of every Jew was necessary. Fear of Jewish power lay at the heart of the Holocaust. Hitler's war was driven by fear of a Jewish ideological victory. The mightiest counterpart to the Aryan is represented by the Jew. He was not just afraid of the Jews, that he was terrified. This is why he always spoke of his fight with the Jews as a war of self-defense, one in which he was now not confident of victory. When over long periods of human history I scrutinized the activity of the Jewish people, suddenly there arose up in me the fearful question whether inscrutable destiny, perhaps for reasons unknown to us poor mortals, did not, with eternal and immutable resolve, desire the final victory of this little nation. Was Hitler correct to fear the Jews? I want to read this for myself one more time. When over long periods of human history, I scrutinized the activity of the Jewish people. Now this is Hitler writing this. Suddenly there arose up in me the fearful question whether inscrutable destiny, perhaps for reasons unknown to us poor mortals, did not, with eternal and immutable resolve, desire the final victory of this little nation. Was Hitler correct to fear the Jews? This is Baruch Fleischman. We're listening to a series here, really terrific book. Who's afraid of the big bad Jew? See, now you can understand how it is that people who are in the news, people who have gained some fame, who are Jewish, and they come out and they say, you know, there's anti-Semitism out there, send to the Holocaust Museum. The Holocaust Museum is the place that real Jew haters want to see us all going. This is Baruch Fleischman, Tikkun Elevator Kola.